Live with you tonight, Turn in Focus, and thanks for staying on. The issue of schools safety is back in focus. 48 schools in Hazy View and surrounding areas closed earlier this week after Mpumalanga teachers protested over high crime. Armed men took cell phones and baki during a recent incident there. Basic Education spokesperson Elijah Mhlanga is with us now for more on that story. Elijah, good to have you. And thank you very much for coming on. If you have a look at the latest statistics from the police, they'll tell you that there are at least over 94 incidents of violent crime that have been reported in the Gauteng schools alone in the last 5 years. 48 schools in Mpumalanga are now saying in this year alone they've seen a huge number of criminal activity taking place at schools. Now, my understanding is that we do have a national school safety strategy or a national school safety framework that would have been put in place. It could either have been in 2016 or 2018 or maybe earlier, you'll correct me. But is this a document that's just sitting, gathering dust, or is it a document that's beginning to do something? Because these teachers are saying the department is doing nothing. Basically, that's what they're saying.
Good evening, Thabo. Thank you very much. Well, the MEC of the Education Department in the Eastern Cape also hosted a media briefing 2 weeks ago in the Nelson Mandela Bay area, where he reported that there were some 122 schools which were also affected by violence in that area. Violence and crime, which is committed by people who live in those communities. And even in that situation, those teachers threatened to resign because they were saying the crime there is too much and it's affecting the business of education. I'm adding this one to indicate that this is now a nationwide crisis. Crime that is affecting our children as they go to school, as they go back home from school. It's affecting our teachers in school as they are there vulnerable. Where there is a group of teachers, you know that there is a lot of opportunities for you as a criminal because there are cell phones, there are wallets, there are handbags that you can take from them. And that is what they are doing. But we are a victim. I'm describing this so that we understand that education is just a victim of crime just like everybody else. The document that you're talking about is a document that guides us in terms of who else should be involved in the fight against crime. Education should coordinate other stakeholders that should help us to work together to fight the crime that is affecting our teachers, that is affecting our learners. But it's not enough to only do it inside the school, because when they leave school, they're still vulnerable. So all of us as communities, we remain affected by the crime, we remain traumatized by it to the extent that teachers are now voicing their anger and frustration in the way that they've done in the past few days in Mpumalanga.
I fully consider, I appreciate that. In the ecological approach risk model, it speaks of that. It speaks of the individual, it speaks of the relationship where the parents would be playing a role. Then it speaks of community. That's where the school is. The framework itself acknowledges a fair degree of the role of school in violent prevention and where you fit in. I just want to determine if there is readiness in the implementation of the framework, especially in the area where you are fitting in. For example, identifying, responding, and evaluating interventions from educators and non-educator staff at school that needs to come up with what you could call a school safety action plan.
Yeah, so in this conversation that we are having now, we have already described 2 categories of the crime that we need to deal with. So insofar as the department is concerned, there is crime and violence that is happening inside a school, perpetrated by learners, involving learners and maybe some teachers as well. That's where we dedicate most of our time and resources to address that. And it starts with what we are doing inside the classroom, changing the mindset, trying to influence the children, the learners, to resort to peaceful measures as opposed to the violence that we are seeing, some of them meeting out against each other with knives and fist fights that take place, and some of the bullying incidents that are taking place. So that's where we come in and teach and focusing on mindset and behavior change. But when it comes to the other category, which is the crime that is happening in the community, affecting learners and affecting teachers, there it means that we need to work with other stakeholders. Western Cape is another example where there's a lot of gangsterism. The gangsters are shooting each other, and the learners and teachers get caught up in the crossfire when the violence and the crime is taking place. So in that situation, it means that we now need to look at a broader approach and say, who else is involved in this? That's where you find the police. That's where you find SGB. That's where you find community-based organizations and other stakeholders that are there, from traditional religious leaders and other leaders that are there that should be working together with us. So in that situation, if one stakeholder is not doing their work, we're not going to win, because we need a situation where communities understand that the crimes are done by people that live in that very community. The perpetrators are known by us who live in that area where the school is located. Question is, what do we do about it? When we know that they've committed a crime, do we hand them over to the police? Do we isolate them, and do we really open cases and go and stand in court and give the justice system the evidence that's required for convictions to be secured so that we can send these people to jail? So that is what is required. There's a lot of community work that needs to happen, and that partnership between the authorities and the community needs to be very strong for us to make an impact that we really want to see. So it is important that we also ask those questions to the other stakeholders that are affected by this, to say, seeing that we know the people that break into schools to steal food meant for the learners through the school nutrition program, do we know the people that are breaking into the schools to steal expensive equipment, because it is then sold in this very community, but we find that some of us in that very community will buy these things, which means we create a market for the criminals that are damaging the future of our children. So there's a lot that needs to be done by all of us. No single stakeholder can solve this one.
Fully concur. But let's look at that aspect of things. For example, you would have in place, as you would know, a signed protocol between yourself and the South African police on the implementation of particular protocols. This was signed in 2011 on the prevention of crime and violence in old school. How are you holding each other accountable on that particular protocol? For example, things like the devices that needs to be used to monitor drug use in school and drug peddling and so on and so forth.
Yeah, so how we work together is that we agreed with the police that they would proactively come to schools to talk to learners about crime, its impact on you as an individual, but on your future as well. They do that when there's time to do that, seeing that there are also other priorities. So they make time to come and do that. That's the first part. The second part is where they join our school communities by participating in the searches that are taking place in the schools. They do that, and they find all sorts of things. I mean, we have been releasing together with them some of the items that are found in the possession of the learners. We're talking about guns, we're talking about knives, and in some cases like alcohols. I mean, I will not forget that picture coming from the Western Cape, indicating that some learners brought full unopened bottles of wine to school in their school bags, which they brought there. So those are some of the things that we find. But there's also another disturbing thing, and this one, I witnessed it myself when I joined the police somewhere in Eguruleni, where the school had organized a search. And the police found lots and lots of drugs in the bags and possession of these learners, and they were put aside. The parents were called, and even before the parents could listen to the whole story of what the children had done, they were already defending their children, saying, my child doesn't do drugs, my child has no capacity to do the things that you say he has done, only to be embarrassed when they get to the school to find that indeed that child has done that they were found in possession of the things that they were reported. So we have that conflict as well, where some parents are very quick to defend their children because they know them to be a different person when they are home, when in fact they are another person when they are on their way to school, as influenced, one, by their friends, but also the drug peddlers who operate in the vicinity of schools, who are not reported by members of the community. In some cases, we know that they will say they are reported and nothing is done. But at the end of the day is that parents, sometimes you will find them defending their children even when they have done these things. So that's the other challenge that we find. But the other one is that one where there's availability of weapons, which the children are taking to school. You recall that there was a case recently from Jamestown where that learner took a firearm from home, took it to school, shot another person there. So that's the other contributing factor that is going into the increase in the violence. There was another incident in the Northwest where this other boy as well went home, took a knife, came back to school, stabbed a child right in front of other learners inside the classroom. So those are the other things that you have to deal with. But the question is, how do you deal with that one? How do you protect a teacher from a learner? Because the nature of their relationship requires that they come into close physical contact.
So, I mean, I know you mentioned this, that some of it is external. There's a thing in the framework that envisage a holistic approach that would have a school safety committee that has that external function of being able to be in touch with the communities and be able to take the messaging from the school to the communities and get feedback from the communities as well. So I want to ask you if, for example, you have done an audit of the school safety plans in all the schools. Do you have a sense of whether those things are in place? Because I look at that school in Jamestown and ask myself, if there is a committee, there is a plan of such, would that gun have not been identified? I don't know. But would they have had a better sense of identifying and responding and in evaluating potential threats?
Yeah, so the school governing body is supposed to coordinate that particular committee, just like the Schools Act empowers them to establish any other committee. But the safety committee is an important one under normal circumstances, because the issue of learner safety and teacher safety and staff in general is critical, because we're not just talking about violence or crime, we're also talking about the safety of the physical environment, whether everything that should be in place is indeed in place. So that committee would be responsible for such. But let me give you an example. In Tembisa, about 3 years ago, there was a teacher who was shot dead, a deputy principal, in fact, shot dead immediately outside the school gate, where there are houses. In fact, 10 meters from the gate of that school, there are houses, many of them. And for days and months, in fact, up until today, I've never heard of any arrest of anyone, even though the shooting took place in broad daylight. That means that another stakeholder who was supposed to play their part outside the school environment has not done their part, because the victim's family are still grieving today, and yet the perpetrators are walking free wherever they are, if they have not been caught for other cases. But on this particular one, as far as we know, the committee has not come forward to report who might have done it, even though they parked the car outside the school gate and waited for their victim, shot her dead, and then left. So in the school, it was safe, but outside the school, it wasn't, which means the one part of that stakeholder base which should be working together was working, but the other part wasn't working, which is what I said earlier, that in this chain, if one stakeholder doesn't do what they were supposed to do, then clearly the criminals should continue to do what they think is right for them, because they know that there will be no consequences. So it's critical that while we question and ask and interrogate education about what education is doing to protect its staff, its people, the question should also be raised and directed to members of the community to say, the perpetrators are with us. They park outside our school. They wait there and cause this damage. What are we doing about it? In some other instances, we see the children fighting. We don't act as adults to try help them resolve the conflict. But also because we use violence ourselves as adults, which is what they see and learn, and when they do it, we therefore lose the credibility to tell them what not to do. So we also need to reflect as adults. Take the very same example of Mpumalanga. In the past week, there have been protests in the Mkhuhlu area with the main road closed there. And you see the type of behavior that is taking place there, where people are blocking roads and there are violent incidents. People are not being allowed to go to work. The young people are also affected. They can't go to school. They are looking at this and saying, so if the adults are doing this, it means we can also do it in the first opportunity that we get, which means for us to fix this whole thing, it needs to start with the individual and look at yourself. The things that you do, what message are you conveying to the younger ones?
Elijah, appreciate your time this evening. Thank you very much for coming on. Basic Education spokesperson Elijah Mhlanga there with us for reaction to that story.